This is Revelation chapter 16, the vials of wrath poured out, part 4, and I am still continuing on with the first vial of wrath. I'm going to go back now to the prophecy and look at the different aspects in the prophecy and relate this to its fulfillment. So to quickly summarize the background of the events leading up to the first vial of wrath being poured out and the start of the French Revolution, we saw that the French kingdom removed the salt of the earth. The Huguenots were slaughtered in vast numbers. Then came the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and with that, among other things, Huguenot schools were closed, Bibles, hymnals and devotional books were burned. There was further persecution of the Huguenots. There was their forced expulsion or forced conversion to the Roman Catholic faith. Huguenots flee France in their hundreds of thousands. And in the void that was left behind, atheism and human reason flourished. Morality and mercy was vanquished, and in their place, immorality and the spirit of retribution abounded. As we have seen previously, we are at the right time. One of the first prominent key prophetic time periods is about to expire as chapter 16 opens. Starting in AD 529, the old Roman law was abolished and replaced with a new legal system, and included in this was a decree by the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian declaring the Bishop of Rome to be the chief bishop of all the churches and that all must be subject to him, and this was in AD 533. And then 1,260 years later, in 1789, the French Revolution burst forth in the beating heart of the Church of Rome in France, and then in 1793 the Reign of Terror began, in which France declared war on the ruling classes of its own nation and that of the other nations around it. And with all of that in mind, we again read Revelation 16 verse 1, "And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the 7 angels, Go your ways, and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image." Once again, the Bible interprets itself, so we don't need to speculate what Revelation 16 verse 2 means when it tells us of a noisome and grievous sore. The meaning of the language of the prophecy used in Revelation 16 is unmistakable. In Isaiah chapter 1, we read of the state of the kingdom of Judah, and it was beset with a terrible disease. A disease that infected the political, judicial, economic, and religious aspects of that nation. And so we read in Isaiah 1, picking it up in verse 4, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord, they have provoked the Holy One of Israel unto anger, they are gone away backward. In verse 6, from the sole of the foot even unto the head there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with ointment. Nobody can doubt that Isaiah chapter 1 is telling us of the spiritual and moral condition of the Judah nation. It was sick and diseased from head to toe. So sick it could not be made whole, and this is what we have before us in Revelation chapter 16. And the fact was that the sickest nation of Papal Europe at this time was France. Revelation 16 verse 2 tells us that there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast and upon them which worshipped his image. Not only was France and its royal family beset by an actual disease of smallpox at this very time, but we have seen that there was a far worse disease at work, poisoning the lifeblood of the nation. When we look at the historians who recorded these events, we find that they use the same language that we find in the prophecy to describe the outbreak of the French Revolution. And while this does not in and of itself prove the fulfillment of the prophecy, it certainly does demonstrate how appropriate it is that these things should have been first described this way in the book of Revelation. Here we read from the book The Life and Letters of Barthold George Niebuhr, Volume 3, and not only was this writer a Prussian historian, but he was also a Prussian ambassador to the Vatican, and in talking about the French Revolution of 1789, he described it as the breaking out of a local disease peculiar to the Roman Catholic nations. And in the prior page of the same book, the author refers to the malignity of the disease exclusively proper to the countries where it was indigenous, France and the south of Europe. Sir Walter Scott described it this way: the disclosure of wasting sores, useless and disgusting unless when shown to a surgeon for the purpose of a cure. Friedrich von Schlegel said in his book, The Philosophy of History, the infidel party in the last century by no means constituted a distinct and separate sect, but was like a deadly contagion of the spirit of the times, infecting all beside and around, above and below it, whithersoever the wind of chance or breath of fanatic zeal might carry it. And then over many more pages, Schlegel, still speaking of the French Revolution, says it was a general political malady and universal epidemic of the age. Edmund Burke, in his book Reflections on the Revolution, talks of it as an internal corruption, a sort of dry rot. Sir Archibald Allison talks about the fever of revolution. C.M. Butler says in his book Lectures on the Book of Revelations the following: the propriety of this language of prophecy is the more obvious from the fact that secular writers upon the same subject use the same or similar illustrations. The French father Lambert calls the irreligion of the period a horrible ulcer, a moral gangrene. Burke constantly uses the phrases the fever of Jacobinism, the epidemic of atheistical fanaticism, the malignant French distemper, the plague, the living ulcers, as expressive of the moral corruption of the revolutionary principles and practices. And so once again, we can clearly see that we have a more sure word of prophecy. Prophecy is history foretold, and history is prophecy fulfilled. And for the futurists or some other prophecy experts so-called to come along and tell us that this is going to relate to a future event where a biological weapon or something like this will be unleashed on the earth is to totally misunderstand the language of prophecy and to end up with something that is completely false and misleading. Now let's look at the Reign of Terror, which was the most violent part of the French Revolution and commenced in the year 1793, which was when King Louis XVI was executed for treason in January 1793, and this was also 1,260 years, the times and half a time, since the Eastern Emperor Justinian proclaimed the Pope to be the head of the Church, and that all must be subject to him. And so as we come to 1793, this was when the blowtorch was not only turned on the French nobles, but also on the Catholic Church. From the Britannica we read, Reign of Terror, also called The Terror, French La Terreur, period of the French Revolution from September 5th, 1793 to July 27th, 1794, with civil war spreading from the Vendée and hostile armies surrounding France on all sides. The revolutionary government decided to make terror the order of the day, September 5th decree, and to take harsh measures against those suspected of being enemies of the revolution, nobles, priests and hoarders. In Paris, a wave of executions followed. In the provinces, representatives on mission and surveillance committees instituted local terrors. From Henry Grattan Guinness's book History Unveiling Prophecy, under the section dealing with the French Revolution stage and speaking of the Reign of Terror, we read, "In its victims, first the nobles and ecclesiastics only were included. By degrees the whole landed proprietors were reached, but now the work of destruction seemed to be approaching every class above the lowest. On the list of revolutionary tribunal in the latter days of the Reign of Terror are to be found tailors, shoemakers, hairdressers, butchers, farmers, mechanics, and workmen accused of anti-revolutionary principles." This was the time of the guillotine, at least for a while, and Grattan Guinness continues, "At Lyons, the scaffold opposite the Hotel de Ville, where the rivals were conducted, was kept in ceaseless employment. Around its bloody foundations large quantities of water were daily poured, but they were inadequate to wash away the ensanguined stains or remove the fetid odour. So noxious did they become that Doiffoya, the functionary entrusted with the executions, was obliged to remove it to another situation, where it was placed directly above an open sewer, 10 feet deep, which bore the gore away to the Rhone. At length, when the executions had risen to 30 or 40 a day, the guillotine was placed in the middle of the bridge at Morand in the centre of the Rhone, into which the stream of blood at once fell, and into which the headless trunks and severed heads were precipitated. Yet even this terrible slaughter, which went on without intermission for 3 months, appeared insufficient to the Jacobins." And still with Grattan Guinness, going back a few pages earlier, where he speaks of the Reign of Terror, and I will add that he is not limiting his comments just to the typical 1793 to 1794 period. He's looking beyond that, and he says, "The Reign of Terror witnessed the slaughter of 1,022,000 persons, of all ranks and ages, and of both sexes, till the streets of Paris ran with blood, and the guillotines could not overtake their work. Thousands were mowed down by grape-shot fusillades, drowned in noyades, where, in loaded vessels, hundreds of victims were purposely sunk in the rivers, roasted alive in heated ovens, or tortured to death by other infernal cruelties. Christianity was publicly renounced, and a prostitute enthroned as goddess of reason at Notre Dame, and worshipped by the National Convention and by the mob of Paris with the wildest orgies of licentiousness, morality as well as mercy having perished with religion." Over a few more pages, Grattan Guinness talks about the wholesale revolutionary massacres in Paris and throughout France, and compares this to the St. Bartholomew Day massacre of 1572, which we looked at previously, and he shows that what followed through the judgments of God was much greater and more severe than what occurred at the hands of Roman Catholic France. He says, "The great massacre of St. Bartholomew was cast into the shade by the St. Bartholomew of 5 years, as the massacre of the Revolution has been called. More than 30,000 were massacred in the city of Lyons, at Nantes 27,000, in Paris 150,000, in La Vendée 300,000. In all France about 2 millions of persons were massacred, of whom 250,000 were women, 230,000 children, and 24,000 priests." And down a little further we read, "Wearied at length with the labour of hewing down so many victims, they fell upon the plan of instituting a mock tribunal, with the murderer Maillard for its president, in which, after going through the form of a trial, they turned them out to be massacred by the people, who thronged the prison doors, loudly clamouring for their share in the work of extermination. The forms of justice were prostituted to the most inhumane massacre. Torn from their dungeons, the prisoners were hurried before a tribunal where the President Maillard sat by, torchlight with a drawn sabre before him, and his robes drenched with blood. Officials with drawn swords and shirts stained with gore surrounded the chair. A few minutes, often a few seconds, disposed of the fate of each individual. Dragged from the pretended judgment hall, they were turned out to the populace, who thronged round the doors, armed with sabres, panting for slaughter, and with loud cries, demanding a quicker supply of victims. No executioners were required. The people dispatched the condemned with their own hands, and sometimes enjoyed the savage pleasure of beholding them run a considerable distance before they expired. And still more as we go a few more pages over. So immense were the numbers of those who were cut off by the guillotine or moved down by the fusillades, that 300 men were occupied for 6 weeks in covering with earth the vast multitude of corpses that filled the trenches which had been cut in the place of the department at Nantes to receive the dead bodies. 10,000 died of disease, pestilence, and horror in the prisons of that department alone. And still more as we go a few more pages over. So immense were the numbers of those who were cut off by the guillotine or moved down by the fusillades, that 300 men were occupied for 6 weeks in covering with earth the vast multitude of corpses that filled the trenches which had been cut in the place of the department at Nantes to receive the dead bodies. 10,000 died of disease, pestilence, and horror in the prisons of that department alone. It seems amazing, at least in my own experience, that many people don't know much about the French Revolution. It's often portrayed as a wonderful thing, and you don't really hear about the brute beast behaviour that was exhibited by the masses as they cast off all restraint and bathed themselves in blood and gore, the blood of their fellow man. Even worse than this, perhaps, is that there is no recognition of the terrible judgment of God in bringing this about on such a wicked nation, and I'm going to talk more about that now. So, having contemplated the shocking things which we have been reading, let's ask the question, why did God allow this? Specifically, why did God judge thus? What brought forth, let's remind ourselves, what brought forth such terrible retribution? And the answer to this is given in the same chapter, just a few verses down. We read in Revelation 16 verse 5, "And I heard the angel of the water say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus." Let's remember, this is the judgment of God upon them which had the mark of the beast. It says in verse 6, "For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy." Firstly, God is righteous. Amen. And this was divine retribution upon an anti-Christian nation and a beast kingdom that was drunk with the blood of the saints and the prophets. God had seen what they had done. God had not forgotten all those who had loved not their lives unto the death and had been murdered and butchered for standing with Christ and his word. And now God moved. And it's a fearful thing when he moves his hand against his enemies. And what was meted out was just and fitting to the wicked nation and to Papal Europe. And if this is a bit of a shock to you, we need to understand who we are dealing with. So many people have a weak and effeminate Jesus Christ who wouldn't hurt a fly. But here we are seeing the wrath of the Lamb. "Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art, and which was, and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus, for they have shed the blood of the saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy." And to that I'm going to say amen, because that is the word of the Lord. Amen. Let's not forget that the ultimate and final day of the Lord is coming. And when he deals with his enemies finally and for all time, when he metes out divine retribution, it's not going to be a picnic. In Daniel chapter 2, the stone hits the feet of the image, and the whole edifice of human government, which is still perpetuated today in the Fourth World Empire, this whole edifice collapses and is smashed to pieces, and the wind blows the whole thing away. The wicked are raised up very high today. They run our governments, our monetary system, the education system, and the rest of it, including Big Pharma and the mass vaccination, so-called, being forced on billions of people on the earth. God's not caught off guard. He's on the throne, as we have seen in Revelation 4 and 5, and when the time comes, the wicked are going to be destroyed from off the earth. They're going to be taken away, and the righteous shall remain. The righteous aren't going anywhere. The righteous stay here, and the wicked are taken away. Amen. The meek shall inherit the earth. It's not going to be turned over to a one-man antichrist to make a nuisance of himself for 7 years. That's hogwash. That's the stuff of futurism that was taught by the Church of Rome. The only ones who are going to be taken away are the wicked. Now, as it stands today, very few Christians have the oil of illumination, so they don't understand these things, and many are going to be found lacking, as is shown in the parable of the 10 virgins. But let us do our part to spread the oil of understanding while it is yet day, for the night cometh in which no man can work. This is the end of Revelation 16 part 4, and also with the end of this part I'll close out our look at the first vial of wrath. In the next part we're going to go on and look at vials 2, 3, 4 and 5.